Okay, so there were actually two cases that were heard from the same school, but one was actually from the law school, and the other one was from the undergraduate school. So we're actually going to take a look at this issue, which actually both cases came out of Michigan in the same exact year, and the court took those cases in the same exact time. Basically, they gave the court the opportunity to hear the differences between what it means to go to graduate school and what it means to go to undergraduate school. So undergraduate is like just what you're going to do after you graduate here. You'll go right on to college. And then after that, you go to graduate school if you choose, and you go to, like a master's program of some kind. So what's interesting about these two cases is that they gave the court the opportunity to say, oh, we like this one, but we don't like that one. It's similar to how it dealt with the University of California versus Bakke. It's very controversial, so it kind of came out in the middle. University of California versus Bakke. The courts are saying you could do affirmative action programs, but not this one. So no one's really totally happy, and no one's totally sad. And then with these two cases, a similar thing happened. One, they allowed it, and the other one, they didn't. So basically, affirmative action programs still survive after these two cases, but the ways in which they can work are important. So remember, that's what you're trying to do here. You're trying to say, all right, we're going to do an affirmative action program, but like, what can you do and what can't you do? All right, so this case is Gratz versus Bollinger. And it deals with Jennifer Gratz, pictured right there, up there, in front of the court, actually. She actually applied to the University of Michigan's College of Literature, Sciences, and the Arts, and she had a GPA with 3.8 and an ACT score, which is just like a SAT, but a different one. She got a 25. In 1997, another person also applied for school at the University of Michigan, and he got a 3.0 and a higher ACT score, 28. And they both were denied admissions. They basically made a claim that this school that used affirmative action programs as a tool by which to think about whether or not students would get into the college didn't do it appropriately. That they made race a factor in making admissions because the courts basically say, rather the school said that they did it for a compelling state interest, and that interest was diversity. So remember before we said that the compelling state interest in Bakke versus California was not really clear, and that's why they didn't allow that program, but allowed for affirmative action programs if they had a compelling state interest. Well, they have good lawyers. The university said that their reason for doing it was because they wanted diversity. So is diversity a compelling state interest? And is the method that they did it constitutional? Basically, they had a policy where they admitted virtually all qualified applicants. So one of these misnomers about affirmative action programs is that it's getting in minorities that are not qualified. But they are saying that they are first qualified and race becomes a factor. Like you might factor all kinds of things in someone's admission to a university, like do they play sports? Do the parents actually go to that university prior? All those things go into a university's admissions process as to who gets in and who doesn't get in. But all qualified applicants who were members of three historically oppressed groups, African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans, that were considered. Here's actually what they used to determine whether or not applicants would get in. I find this fascinating. So you've got two sides to this. This is actually like a rubric that they used. They got applicants, they came in, and they took a look at them and had to make decisions about who's going to get into the university. On the left side here is the academic component, and on the right side are like other factors that aren't necessarily academically oriented. So getting into college, admission in 2000, well, in 1995 and 1997, and maybe until 2003 when the courts actually heard this case, we actually kind of know how University of Michigan did it because the case went to court. They had to reveal their process as a part of the the discovery of all the materials. So look at this. Academic. So there are all kinds of points that you can get. So look at this. If you got, let's say you got a 3.6 GPA, you got 72 points. Then if you go to a really good school, like maybe one of the top, 10 in the country or something like that, this is your school factor, like the best, go to a really good school, you get a total of 10 points here. Go to a really good school. That's the max you can get for that. But if you go to a not as great a school, but you have, pretty high GPA, they kind of counter that with taking a look at how good is the school generally. So go to one of the worst schools in America, you don't get any points for the school factor. You go to a okay school, you get like a one point here. A little bump to say like, hey, you're not going to a better school than these people who are going to one of the worst schools. They're basically saying we understand that grades in one school don't mean the same thing as grades in another school, and that's how they accounted for that. And then the curriculum factor. So basically they take a look at, well, what kinds of courses that you're taking. If like you took really easy courses and you ended up with a pretty high GPA, and then you don't get as many points as someone else. If like you go to really, really easy courses, you actually end up losing 2 points. And if you take really hard courses, take a whole bunch of APs and really difficult courses, you get 4 points. Okay, so I talked about the academic side, but there's actually this other element of this, which is other factors that aren't academically oriented, and they run the gamut from all kinds of things, including race, because that's why this case went to the courts in the first place. But it's interesting to note that there isn't just race that is a factor. It's not just educational or academic background that determines whether or not you would get into a school in the 90s in Michigan. Um, One thing was geography. So, like, what's geography? Geography here is that if you were a Michigan resident, like you lived in Michigan, you got 10 points for living in Michigan. And by the way, this whole side, you can only get 40 points. So once you get 40, that's the max you can get for this. So geography, 10 points if you live in Michigan. If you lived in an underrepresented Michigan county, you got 6 points. I think that's Detroit. So Detroit was a socioeconomically disadvantaged area, and Detroit was the whole county. So that would probably be a county that would do really well. So if you live in Michigan and you live in Detroit, 16 points. You're almost halfway there to getting the maximum number of points for other factors. If your parents, also alumni, if your parents or your step parents were alumni, people who went to that university, 4 points. And here's the kicker. Your essay, 1 whole point. That's it. 1 point. Then they talk about like what you did as a person prior to going into that university, and they have it under something called personal achievements. So there's a total that you can get here. You can get up to 5. You only get 1 of these. So if you were someone who did really well and were recognized at some level, like you won, like or served at the state level of some organization, like you were the president of JSA for the state of New Jersey, you got 1 point. If you were the Northeast Regional president of JSA, 3 points. If you were the national president of JSA, 5 points. So if you're just the president of your JSA at the local, like at your school, 0. It doesn't count for anything. So after that, you've got like things like leadership. Same kind of thing. Like you serve in some leadership capacity of 1, 3, 5. State, regional, national. Then there's these other factors. Now here is where race is a factor. It was 20%, or rather half of the other factors that you could get. So, for instance, if you were socioeconomically disadvantaged. That means that you were from a group of people that are historically not doing well financially, like you were lower class, I guess, or you're just like earning underneath the poverty line. You would get 20 points just for that. If you were an underrepresented racial or ethnic minority group, 20 points. So if you're a poor black person, 40 points. You get the 40 points of the other factors automatically. If you were going into nursing and you were a male, you got 20 points. If you were going to that university because you were a really good athlete, you got 20 points. If the provost is just a position of someone at the university, someone in admissions, that's like an administrator of some kind at a very high level. He could just, or she could just decide, here's 20 points. How does that usually work? My guess is your parents give some money to that university. The provost goes, I like those dollars, 20 points. So, yeah, race was a factor. In fact, you would get points. You would get a fair amount of points. You'd get 20 points. But it wasn't the whole thing, right? So if you add up all these factors, and there's one I forgot on the academic side, which was your ACT or your SAT score, if you could get up to 12 points there. If you add these all up, let's add this up. If you have a total number of 80 points that you can get for your GPA, that's 80, plus another 10 for the school factor, and the curriculum factor would get you 8 points, and the ACT or the SAT would get you 12 points. On the academic side, 80 plus 10 is 90, plus 8 plus 12 is another 20, so 110 on this side, and then 140 on the other side. There were 150 points that you could get using this rubric. I don't know why it's divided out that way. So if, let's say, we consider what was the total percentage of points that you would get if it were just related to race. So let's say you just got the 20 points for race as a factor, and you divide it out by 150. It's basically 13.33%. If I do my math right, that seems correct. So it's less than 15% of the total thing was race related. Here's the thing. A lot of other universities were allowing for black people to get into universities, and they did it, not allowing for them, but like, because that sounds odd, that use race as a factor determining whether or not someone would get into university. But they never wrote it down. They never said, this is the quota. We're going to have 16 spots like they did in Bakke versus California. They said no to that. You can do affirmative action, but no quotas. Well, can you do this kind of rubric thing? The question to the court, does the University of Michigan's use of racial preferences and undergraduate admission, that rubric that you just saw, violate the Equal Protection Clause? Is it something we should look at really, really closely? Remember we said with affirmative action cases or any case that deals with race as a factor, where there might be a thought about equality, they look at it really closely. There has to be a compelling state interest, a really good reason. And the court said, yeah, it was a violation of the Constitution. It was not equal protection under the law. Why? Because a point system could not be used because the automatic distribution of 20 points, or about 1/5 of the points needed to graduate admission to every single underrepresented minority solely because of race, was not narrowly tailored and did not provide the individualized consideration. So what the courts are saying here is that for a case to get past constitutional muster when it comes to affirmative action, they can't use this rubric. They can't use it. They can't use a quota in Bakke, and they can't use a rubric here. So if I were giving advice, I'd say something about that. and it has to be narrowly tailored to an interest. And that interest was diversity. They named it. They did say that it was diversity, but just by doing it this way, they weren't convinced. By the way, 1 divided by 5. I want to see if their math is right. I think my math might be a little bit off. It sounds like it's more like 20%. I must be adding something up wrong, but 20% of the points were going to applicants because of race, according to this. So to summarize so far, no quotas, no to rubrics, but generally yes to the theory of affirmative action. So maybe you just shouldn't write it down. You know, they had a quota, they wrote it down, we able to figure it out. Like they should just like say, we're using race as a factor, but we're not going to write it down. Well, I think with graduate admissions, there's so many applicants that come through that it was so hard to go through all those applicants that generally they came up with a rubric not just for the race factor, but for like every other element of deciding whether or not someone would get into the university, like geography, alumni, essay, personal achievement, leadership, miscellaneous, the GPA, the school factor, the curriculum factor. They just like, oh, we can't take it. Thousands and thousands of applicants. We need a rubric. Well, when you put it down into a rubric and it gets looked at really closely, like it did with this court case, and you use race as a factor, that's a no-no, according to the courts in 2003. All right, so the next case that we'll take a look at is Grutter versus Bollinger. This is the one that happened at the law school.